I'd like to ask Michael Berger to join us. Michael has a particular parentage to this workshop. Michael professionally is a professor at Emory University in the Department of Religion, where he teaches courses on the history of Judaism and Jewish ethics and rabbinic literature and modern Jewish thought. And Michael joined us as a presenter in the early 2000s when we began to earnestly not just begin the story of modern Israel with the 1880s or the 1840s or failed emancipation, but we jumped back to Abraham and we started with the origins of Jewish nationhood and the Jewish people. And it's now fashionable to title a presentation From Abraham to the Abraham Accords. We won't be doing all of that. Michael, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
I have about 15 minutes to do 3,000 years, so please put your seatbelts on. We're going to be moving rather quickly through the history, but I have some main points for you to take away, and there's a lengthy video that you can watch. It's on the CIE website to get this in detail. We're going to just take the highlights of that and raise some important points that will allow me to pass the baton to Ken. In front of you, you see the Israeli national anthem. It would be great to sing it together, but I think with different videos and audios, it would be hard. But I think we can all point out that the second half of the anthem, Od lo avda tikvateinu, hatikva bat shnot alpayim, it's supposed to refer to a 2,000-year-old hope to return to the land. So the fundamental question, the essential question, is if the Jews' hope has been around for 2,000 years, why did Zionism only emerge in the late 19th century? And the enduring understanding I'd like you all to have is that the Jews' relationship to the land actually evolved over time. And the summary slide, and we'll repeat it at the end, is the first temple period is a nation in its land. The second temple period, another 600 years, is land as center of a diaspora. In the post-temple period, meaning after the destruction, a period of time that we're commemorating now in the Jewish calendar, it morphed again into land as messianic hope. And in the modern period, that transition is what Ken is going to be addressing in his remarks. The key concept I'd like to start off with is covenant. Again, CIE materials all back this up. A lot of text that you could pull out of the Bible. The two main concepts of covenant that appear in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, in the book of Genesis, it's presented as a covenant of the patriarchs, meaning their descendants will inherit the land, and it is an unconditional, eternal relationship. Whereas in the covenant of Sinai, presented in the books of Exodus, Shemot, going forward, it's that the triangle is God, Torah, and people, and the relationship to the land is conditional on observance. To reconcile these two covenants, we basically have this new concept. The land is the arena of a conditional covenant, meaning obey, you can remain and thrive and flourish. If you disobey the covenant, you will be sent into exile. You can see the portions in Leviticus chapter 18, in Deuteronomy chapter 29 and 30, and that final conclusion in Deuteronomy puts it as follows. You'll see it on the right side of the screen. The relationship with God is eternal. That allows the possibility of repentance. Again, this is the biblical view that is forever. It's never canceled. But that does mean that if you repent, you will be allowed to return to the land. So if you're in the land and obeying, you'll thrive. If you're disobeying, you'll be exiled, and you'll only be able to come back if you repent. So now we go from the concept to the history. The first phase, which I call a nation in its land, from whatever the beginnings of the Jewish people in the land, at least by the time of King David, is the year 1000 BCE. His son Solomon builds a temple according to the books of the Bible. And that first temple period is the Jews are a nation and divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom after Solomon's death. But as you could see below the yellow box on the timeline, Assyrians start to conquer territory, and the Jewish state, Israel, becomes a vassal state. And then after the Assyrians, the Babylonians. Okay, so remember that we always have to think about the application of the covenants in the larger context of geopolitical realities, of historical and cultural developments, and of course, religious change along the way. So if we look at our timeline broken down, we have the conquest, that's the books of Joshua and Judges, then the monarchy in the books of Samuel and Kings. We have Saul and David and Solomon, and after Solomon's death, as I pointed out, this large territory is divided and it actually shrinks a little bit to a northern kingdom of the 10 tribes and a southern kingdom of Judah. Historically, the Assyrians, that was the first empire I mentioned, as you could see, they conquer the northern kingdom and send everybody into exile. We don't hear from them anymore. After 722 BCE, the Book of Kings, which records this, as well as the prophet Isaiah, presents this as punishment for disobedience, for violating the terms of the covenant. The Babylonians conquer this territory, and Judah becomes a vassal state, rebels, and in 586 BCE, Jerusalem falls and the temple is destroyed. The people are sent into exile. What's remarkable is that 50 years after the Babylonians conquer Judah and send the Jews into exile, the Persians, that's the magenta here, the Persians conquer the same territory, the Babylonian territory, and allow the Jews to return to their land. However, not all of them do. And the Second Temple period, which launches with the Persian Empire, it lasts about 600 years, from 537 BCE to 70 CE. And look at all of the sovereign empires. You start with the Persians, then the Greeks take over. There's a brief period of Hasmonean or Maccabean independence. That's the story of Hanukkah. And then the Romans come in and take over. This is the extent of the Persian Empire. They allowed the Jews to return. Not all do. The name of the province is Yehud, and that's why Jews are called Yehudi, because the reality of the Persian Empire is that you had to belong to a province. Wherever you lived, you belonged to one of the 127 provinces. You may remember the book of Esther. Look how small the province of Yehud is. It's west and north of the Dead Sea. Jerusalem is in the center. But the point is that Jews throughout the empire, they're living in Egypt, they're living in Asia Minor, they're living in Shushan. They see themselves as belonging to the province of Yehud. They belong to what's later called Judea. So there's now a new reality called land as center, and the Jewish diaspora expands during the Persian and Greek periods, getting as far as Italy and all the way east in Mesopotamia and even lower Egypt. So the Jews see themselves as belonging to the land, even if they don't live there. How do they express that? They send letters to Jerusalem's high priest asking for advice and guidance on religious observance. We have some of those letters, actually, papyri on those instructions. Later on, they send the half shekel to participate in the temple cult. The sacrifices that are being offered are contributed to by Jews throughout the empire. Some Jews make a pilgrimage that expands during the Maccabean and then the Roman period. So Jews see themselves as expatriates, if you will, of the province of Yehud. With the conquest of Persia by the Greeks, the Jews begin to develop what we call Messianism, and there's two forms of it, according to Gershom Shalom. The restorative is a human initiative to bring back a dynasty of David, but there's a utopian version of a divine initiative. God will miraculously redeem us and bring us to the glory that will surpass that of King Solomon, and the world will recognize the Jews as worshiping the only God. So there's Messianism where the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel will all come true, but there are two versions. Will it happen based on human initiative or divine initiative? Later on in the Greek Empire, in the period of Greek control, there's some persecution. Parts of Jewish observance are outlawed. We all know about the Maccabees. They revolt. And in 163 BCE, they establish Hanukkah because of those core concepts of covenant, that if they don't observe, they'll be exiled. So they may as well go for broke and try to throw off the Greek control in order to be able to observe properly. The land as center, there's still a diaspora, but Messianism, it's a human initiative we're going to bring about, hopefully, God's assistance to throw off the foreign yoke. And the map on the right, which comes from Bar Navi's Historical Atlas of the Jewish People, you could see it starts off similar to the province of Yehud, but then expands the dark brown and then the light brown, and it becomes an independent state for about 100 years. The Romans come in, there's a revolt, the Jewish revolt against Rome in 66 to 73 CE, so we're out of the before the Common Era, we're in the Common Era, 1950 years ago. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is burned, the center that Jews throughout the empire had known and were familiar with for 600 years, that center is gone. So we're now into phase 3, land as Messianic hope, and I want to break that down. A lot of it has to do with the fact that there were 3 Jewish revolts in the space of 70 years. The temple is destroyed. That was what we just talked about. There's a Jewish revolt in Egypt in 117, and then Bar Kokhba revolts in 132 CE to 135, and that decimates the Jewish population. The Romans are unforgiving. The blood flows in the streets all the way down to the Mediterranean. So what should the Jews do now? This strategy develops, and we're focusing on the rabbinic response. The first thing is to keep the people united with standardized practice, standardized prayer, standardized law. It's called halakha, the way to be a Jew. To religify, that's a fancy word, to the connection to the land. Daily and holiday prayers all mention Jerusalem, all mention the temple, all mention Zion. You can see this on the CIE website, great materials there. Face Jerusalem when you pray. Even when you say grace after meals, thank God for the food, mention the land, mention Jerusalem. Weddings, break that glass, talk about Jerusalem being a widow, and our joy is incomplete. We commemorate the destruction with fast days, 4 fast days throughout the year, as well as mourning practices, leaving parts of your house undone. But the covenant theology, which we saw from the very beginning in our very first concept of covenant, accepting, so to speak, the blame. We were exiled due to our sins and will be restored when we repent. So the response is to hang on as best as possible. But after the Bar Kokhba revolt and the realization that any political effort by the Jews is going to be severely punished, the rabbis doubled down on the idea of Torah study and halakha as the supreme value of what it means to be a Jew. And they supernaturalized the messianism, i.e., they opt for the utopian version and not the restorative, meaning we're going to be on the sidelines. God will bring the Messiah when God is good and ready. So that quiescent, pacifist, very passive posture of the rabbis carries us through a good part of the next 1800 years. So the connection to the land is strictly religious. It's through Torah. If we repent, God will bring us back, but we're not going to be activist. We're not going to pick up arms. We saw where that landed us last time, 3 times in 70 years. We're not going to endure that again. So the process begun during the Second Temple period in the diaspora deepens. And so this period, which extends from the Romans through under Christians and Muslims, Jews are second-class citizens. They're not allowed to participate in civil society. There are a lot of rules against their participation, their exclusion, and that's why this period, which is the longest, is the land as messianic hope. So the last period, which is what Ken is going to usher in a moment, that's the modern period. What changed in the modern period? I'll just begin it. Ken will pick it up. The main features are the Enlightenment. There's a belief that the Bible is not revealed. There's no supernatural involvement. It's not miraculous. It's all human-centered. The nation state in the Western and Central parts of Europe allowed Jews to be invited in as Germans, as Frenchmen, to be equal citizens, but also that religious life is meant to be private. It's not national. It's not collective. The public domain is secular. As we get into the 1800s now with Ken, we have to remember the Western and Central parts of Europe that have one conception, but the Jewish condition in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Russian Empire, and a good part of the Austrian Empire is Jews. They're excluded from civil society, and there's also rising anti-Semitism. I also don't want us to forget that there is a Sephardic diaspora. This is from 1948, but the numbers were relatively close, where Jews are dhimmis, which is second-class citizens. They're excluded from the Muslim world. And so this longing for a messianic return to the land of Israel is still very vibrant and real among Jews of Arab lands.
I hope you have been able to absorb Michael's condensed version of 3,000 years. If you search for the timelines on the website, you'll also find a chronology of Jerusalem, and that will also give you an idea of the distance traveled and the context. This is our contemporary Middle East. I'm sort of working backwards, but I'll get to Michael in a minute. So here is our little speck of land in relation to the entire region. That's where we are in 2020. What I'd like to do is provide you with an understanding, a little bit repetition of what Michael just provided, and then take us all the way down to the present. In other words, put my presentation now of the 18th to the 21st century into the context of what Michael has given you earlier, and what we'll also speak about either later on today on foreign policy or other issues that are on Israel's contemporary agenda. So what formed the identity? Belief, choice, self-determination, and community. They're all important concepts, and they're expressed, they're used, they're applied, whether you're around the cities in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Western Mediterranean, or you're in Western Europe or Eastern Europe. Jews decide to believe in one God. They decide to retain their identity. They decide even to die for that identity. They get expelled. Land is still the center. It's still part of who we are. That is what we are. My point to you at this juncture is, too often in defining Jewish identity and the history of modern Israel, or the politics of modern Israel, it's defined in terms of what others have defined Jews as. I know that doesn't sound like good English, but the reality is Jewish identity was there well before there were people who told us they didn't like us, or they didn't welcome us, or they didn't absorb us, or they didn't want to give us equality and civil rights and civil equality, no matter where Jews may have lived in the early, ancient, modern, medieval, contemporary periods. Jews have a characteristic, not only a characteristic of their religion, but they have a characteristic of being a minority and living in a precarious setting. And anti-Semitism evolves and becomes a glue. So if you combine the identity to the glue, if you don't mind me using the phrase, there's a stickiness to it. And the combination of the stickiness is what sustains us. But most of the time it has to do with whether we want to be able to go from Kiddush to Kiddush, from Sabbath to Sabbath, or without having to say Kaddish in between. We'd rather have more Kiddushes than Kaddishes, if I can coin a phrase. We decide to alter reality. We're no longer just laying back and waiting for the Messiah, no longer just engaged in religiosity, no longer just engaged in prayer. But Jews decide in the 18th and 19th century that they need to alter where they live, they need to alter their physical presence, and they also want to, some of them want to alter their practice. You know, that's where we find the origins of Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism. And we practice what we wish, and some of us become assimilated, some of us become absorbed, some of us engage in conversion. But the result is we decide to do something about our condition. And as the condition changes in Eastern and Western Europe, we decide to do more about the changing condition, because we can't affect the change that we really want. That's liberty, freedom, expression of our own privilege and right, freedom of religion. So we decide, as the great Israeli Zionist historian Israel Kolat has said, we decide to intervene in history. We decide to be active. We decide to engage in choice. we decide to apply self-determination in a contemporary sense. It's in the DNA. And the ideas come next. And what are they? Well, there are a whole series of isms, Marxism and socialism and conservatism and liberalism, and then the Zionism. And Zionism is one more of these isms that evolve in the 18th and 19th century. And this is a concept that comes out of the American and French Revolution, out of the unification of Italy and Germany in 1870, 71, that people will cleave together because they have a common heritage, a common language, a common tradition, a common historical experience, oral tradition. And there are those who say, well, isn't it about time that we decided that we wanted to restructure or reestablish or remake our presence in the place where we once had sovereignty? When Chaim Weizmann was involved in drafting the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when he was involved in it along with others in the London office of the Zionist executive, a man by the name of Leonard Stein, no relative, ultimately wrote a book called the Balfour Declaration. It's a 615-page compendium. Leonard Stein suggested that the term establish a national home for the Jewish people, he wanted it to read to reestablish a national home, because he wanted it to show the continuity of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And the British said, no, we're just going to use the word establish. But it was in the minds of the Zionists as they helped craft the 101-word Balfour Declaration. The key to Zionism became, how do you link people to the land? How do you make that happen? Well, you're a minority, which means you have to find people of the majority who are willing to sanction, give you permission, say, sure, go ahead. So Herzl goes to the Ottoman Sultan, and Weizmann's negotiating with the British, and Lord Balfour, and all the members of the British cabinet. And later on, Ben-Gurion will lobby American Jews, and then Weizmann will want to come back and lobby Truman. And then we in the United States and elsewhere, we start lobbying other folks to not only give permission, but to provide for what is needed for this Jewish state. Anyone who thinks that the American Israel Public Affairs Committee or any other Jewish organization that has Israel on their mind in the game of lobbying is doing something that's relatively recent, not so, because as a minority through time, we had to plead our case. We had to plead our case in the ghetto. We had to plead our case as we left the ghetto. These were called charters, Jewish charters that were negotiated between Jewish communal leaders and knights and dukes and czars and princes and kings and popes. These were agreements that we sought in order to seek our protection, so we could make it from Kiddush to Kiddush. And then the actual doing, the actual moving of the linking the people to the land, the aliyot, the institutions, the infrastructure, what I call state making. In doing so, returning to Palestine, returning to Eretz Yisrael, there was a population there. There was a significant Arab population there. They were there going back to Islamic time. Islam conquered Jerusalem, if I'm not wrong, in 636. So there was a population that was there. The Zionists who decided they wanted to go back to Eretz Yisrael had to meet with, had to work with, had to engage. And sometimes the Arabs collaborated with the Zionists in establishing these new places where Jews were living in either urban areas or in rural areas. And the influence of world politics has a major impact on the ability of the Zionists to create and build a national home. If you didn't have the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and 20th century, if you hadn't had the Ottoman Empire collapse, you wouldn't have had the British and the French and others trying to figure out what to do with the Middle East at the end of World War I. And the Zionists were beneficiaries of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, because the Zionists put their hand up and said to the British, look, we'd like to have a place here of our own. We'll work in concert with you. We'll work with the local Arab populations. We'd dearly like to reestablish our presence here. And slowly Zionism grew and Zionism developed. Anyone who believes that the number of Jews who immigrated to Palestine from the 1880s or the 1850s forward was a large number, it was a tiny minority of Jews who immigrated worldwide. 2.5 million Jews immigrated from the 1850s until the 1940s. 2.5 million, 2.5 million. And the number of Jews who actually immigrated to Palestine was about 600,000. And only about 100,000 of them came after World War II. So that the majority of the Jewish population was in Palestine. 450,000 of them were there before 1945. So it wasn't as if Europe just opened up after the Shoah and allowed hundreds of thousands of Jews to immigrate. It was a relatively insignificant number of the total who were there already. Which brings me to my point, which I'll make in a moment, and that essentially is, in my view, from studying land acquisition and Jewish immigration to Palestine, in my view, there was a Jewish state in the making already by 1939. Now, if that's the case, if you accept for the moment that a Jewish state was in the making by 39, that means that the events that occurred between 39 and 45, while they may have been important emotionally, and they may have been important in terms of creating a stamp on Jewish identity because it was a glue, it was an anti-Semitic glue. The reality is the evolution of a Jewish state in a modern political sense evolves from the 1880s until the end of the 1930s in a very significant way. You could not have built the Jewish state. You could have not established the Jewish national home in 1948 had it not already been ongoing from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, well into the 1940s. And that I'm going to focus on in a moment. Jews were engaged in evolving the state, defending the state in the making. This is before May 1948. And then they achieved sovereignty, recognized by the United States and the United Nations and 45 other countries in 1948, 49, 50. They defend the state. They meet, they plan, they execute, they intervene in their future. And then it's Arab national interests that finally accept the sovereignty, but only in 1979. That's when Sadat and Begin signed the peace treaty, and then Jordan and Israel signed the treaty in 94. The year before, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist. Israel recognized the PLO. And then in 2020, the Abraham Accords, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and later on Morocco and the Sudan. And that is the broad overview of the 3,000 years. I'm dealing with the last 150 or the last 200 years. Michael had to condense his entire presentation of 3,000 or 2,800 years into a very short period of time. So to say it was telescoped is an understatement. So here's the Ottoman Empire, the way it looked. So this is what Palestine area looked like in the 1860s. Obviously no borders, obviously no national identities, no Syria, no Jordan, no Palestine. Another view of what this Palestine and Syria looked like in 1915. The British will enter Jerusalem toward the end of World War I. They'll conquer Jerusalem, and then they have to decide what it is they're going to do with Jerusalem. And here is the broader aspect of world history dealing the Zionists another ace. Not only did the Ottoman Empire fall, but the British decided and the French decided they wanted to create spheres of influence, trusteeships for parts of the Middle East. So these trusteeships, called mandates, are established in the Middle East. And what you see in this map is you see that Palestine area is located between Egypt in the south and Iraq in the far east. The British wanted a land bridge between Egypt and the Persian Gulf. So the British put their hand up and told the French, look, we would like to have a trusteeship for Iraq. We would like to have a trusteeship over Palestine because we want to be able to protect the Suez Canal, which we came to in 1881. So here, the geopolitics of international relations comes to play in good stand for the Zionists. When Churchill was asked as colonial secretary in 1921, why aren't we giving the Palestinians an area of themselves? And he said, well, they weren't very helpful to us during World War I. In fact, they weren't helpful at all. I can point to the fact that the Zionists at least didn't hinder us. Now, whether you agree or not agree that the British should or should not have said yes to the Zionists to establish a national home. Remember, they didn't say you could create a state. They said you can create a national home. A distinction that the British made, because they wanted to protect the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities as well. But link Iraq and the Mosul oil fields, and there's going to be an oil pipeline that's going to be built from here through Jordan right to Haifa, and it's going to open in 1935. So if world politics was good to the Zionists in terms of them being on the right side of that history, with the destruction of the Ottoman Empire and the British and the French creating trusteeships, the very fact that oil was now going to be let out at Haifa port in 1935 was significant, because the British were moving from coal to oil-fired ships. And they went from 10% of Middle Eastern oil to be used for their fleets before and immediately after World War I. By the time you get to 1935, it's like 35 to 55%. Haifa becomes absolutely critical, absolutely essential. And the Zionists knew that they had some influence over the British because of their growth and their presence. It's not surprising, therefore, that we would find the Zionists in the 1930s, end of the 30s, buying plots of land in and around Haifa port, because they want to show the British that they could perhaps exert some leverage. Jordan is lopped off from Palestine. It's 80% of the total area of Palestine. Jordan here is created in 1922 by the British. The important reality is the concept of strategy. No one just parachuted a bunch of Zionists or a bunch of Jews after World War II. There had to be areas that the Zionists were interested in buying, which meant there had to be Arabs who were willing to sell. This is a paragraph that I'd like you to read. This is a paragraph that comes from a Jewish National Fund document from 1937. And it's essentially saying that the Jewish National Fund, as we know, was an organization that was interested in land acquisition and land purchase. The Jewish National Fund sat around with a bunch of individuals, men and women alike, who decided what was being offered them for sale and what should they be buying. In other words, more offers were made than there was finances to accept all the offers that were provided. But here, the Upper Galilee, the districts of Beisan, Akko, Judean Hills, and in the south. Why the Upper Galilee? Why was that critical? Well, those are the headwaters of the Jordan. The districts of Beisan of Akko, Beisan, it's where the headwaters of the Jordan dump into the Sea of Galilee, a little bit south. Akko, just north of Haifa. That's where the pipeline's going to dump. The British corridor better have geographic connection between the Mediterranean and Jerusalem. And in the south, the Negev. Now, these are very broad areas, but already you have folks sitting around making decisions on what to buy, where to buy, how much to buy. We have a limited amount of money, and we have offers to sell. And so the idea is to create contiguous areas of Jewish settlement. So much so that by 1937, the British decided, maybe these two communities can't live together. Maybe there's just too much conflict. Maybe we just have to have a place for each one of them. They didn't call for a two-state solution. They called for two entities that would be adjacent to one another, and they would share an economy or economic exchange, and Jerusalem would be internationalized. But the British realized in 1937 already that these communities did not like getting along with one another at all. They settled apart from one another. They actually created separate economies. They created separate institutions. It was pretty notable already by the 30s that there was this divergence of the two communities in two different directions. So this is what Jewish land purchase looked like in 30 and meant settlement or creating kibbutzim, moshavim, rural and urban areas. This is what it looked like in 44. And this is what the final map looked like in 1947 for the division of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. I want to make something crystal clear. When the British decided to offer a concept of partition or division in 1937, and when the United Nations offered the idea of creating two states, no one even remotely came close to saying this is a solution to the Palestinian Arab/Jewish Zionist conflict. The term two-state solution was not used. The word solution was not used. It was a way of pulling the parties apart so they wouldn't be beating each other up. The concept of a two-state solution is something that evolves well into the 1980s and the 1990s. It's a very recent concept, a very, very recent concept. Now, we have on the website items for you to touch upon. You can see Arab leaders meeting in Damascus in 38. You can read about the Mufti of Jerusalem rejecting an Arab state in 10 years because the Jews were present. You can read about an Arab League leader who said, we want no compromise with the Zionists whatsoever. We really don't want to compromise. We don't want you here, period. And this is what he said. And the reason I'm including it is we assume the concept of BDS or delegitimization or anti-Zionism or anti-Israelism is something that's post-67 phenomena. Well, it's not a post-67 phenomena. There were Arabs in Palestine, because of their own political reasons and because of their strong viewpoints, did not want a Zionist presence there. They just didn't want it. And here in 1947, you had the head of the Arab League who's actually meeting with Zionists in a London hotel saying, it may be that we shall lose Palestine, but it's too late, rather than too late. It's too late to talk of peaceful solutions, said Azam Pasha. It's too late. It's too late. Now, the discussion of the UN partition plan. This is what the partition plan looked like. This is what the armistice lines look like. You see that two states were not created as a result of 47. And this is after 67. Now, let me go back again. It's a long history. The reasons the Zionists succeeded is they were committed to perseverance. I think they succeeded because they were a minority. They succeeded because life was precarious. And they wanted to end that as part of the Jewish DNA. Did the state of Israel actually end Jewish precariousness? No. It just made Jews a little bit more safe. And it made it possible that Jews wouldn't be just expendable, but they would have to be tolerated. Israel is at 75. Israel remains unfinished. It's only 75 years old. And the United States at 75 was 1851. And we certainly weren't finished then as a nation.
The question is for you. She asked, how did the beating, quote unquote, begin? My impression was Jews, though reluctant, were willing to live together peacefully, but Arabs began violent revolts.
Early Zionists who came to Palestine in the early immigrations in the first and second Aliyot, they did pretty well in living with the local Arab communities. There were occasional areas of communal disturbance. It wasn't until after World War I, and there was a reorientation geopolitically on where the area of Palestine might go, that the communal discord broke down. 1920, 21, 29, 33, 36 to 39. And again, after partition resolution was voted on November 1947. I don't think it's fair to say that all the Zionists who came to Palestine with a sense of kumbaya. Many of them were willing to accept a middle of the road outlook of, if they don't bother us, we won't bother them. And then you had some who were on the more militant side of Zionism, who not only wanted to dislodge the British, but they reacted to Arab violence as well. The early Zionists were pretty placid in terms of taking the fight to the Arab population. The initial origins of the Haganah is, the term itself is self-defense. It wasn't meant to be an offensive unit.
For Michael, how is the ancient covenant relevant in the classroom? The idea of it is relevant, but practically, how do students feel the connection, or how can we refer to it to inspire a connection?
I think that's the $64,000 question of Jewish education, personally, because it does go to the term that Ken used at the beginning of his presentation about identity. when you are excluded from the wider society and reminded constantly that you're different, it's much easier to retain that sense of connection to somewhere else because you're not really made to feel welcome where you are. America is really quite an exception, and for some, Western Europe is also that kind of exception. I do think that you can talk about, and this is a hard thing, what does it mean to be a Jew? The more you kind of shift it into the terrain or the vocabulary of religion and religious identity, which, as I mentioned briefly, in the modern period is internal and it's personal, it's a matter of conscience. So that doesn't seem connected to a land. The more Jewishness is connected to a kind of civilization or peoplehood, which historically that's what it was. Jews were always, we started by talking about the Jews in their land. They were a nation. How they came to be a nation is an interesting question. It's hard to recover that in detail, but certainly by the year 1000 BCE, they see themselves as a very special kind of, I don't mean special in the sense of revealed, God special chosen. I'm just saying that we're not Philistines, we're not Moabites, we're not Ammonites, we're not Egyptian, we're not Phoenician, we are Israelites or we're Jews. And that sense of peoplehood, we were an ethnic identity. We weren't Lithuanians, we weren't Poles, we weren't Russian, we were Jews, and the world outside reminded us, and we understood ourselves in those terms. So to the extent that you can sort of teach history and not just validate what people necessarily, especially children, think about today, what kind of holidays do we celebrate? What does it mean to celebrate Hanukkah? Now, yes, at times, different groups of Jews emphasize the ethical dimension of some of our holidays. But when you think about it historically, many holidays were about what the Jewish people had gone through. Think about Purim, that we were going to be singled out. If it's appropriate to your audience or age group, talk about anti-Semitism that also singles us out, that we are seen and we see ourselves as a people. And then the more you can emphasize the peoplehood, then to me, the connection to a territory, I don't mean the covenant of if you observe. I agree the Sinai covenant is a harder sell, but the idea that a people has its distinctive culture linked to an identity, like what does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be Russian? I mean, it might be, depending on the sophistication of your audience, appropriate to talk about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine right now. In other words, what is that? Russians are claiming the Ukrainians don't exist as a people. Ukrainians are saying we do exist. So these things are even being debated today. So when I say covenant, I think Ken's portrayal of sort of a connection to a land where we can sort of control our own destiny, and maybe again, Ukraine would be the right place for it, that is allowed and acknowledged almost to every group in the world to some self-determination. I'm not talking about statehood, but self-determination, that is granted virtually every people and is part of the human rights agreement after World War II, that every group should be entitled to self-determination. So that's the way I would interpret the covenant, again, depending on your audience nowadays.
The only thing I would say is the covenants, like prayer, like life cycles, like Shabbat, like Torah, like Shavuot and Sukkot and Pesach, and we read a book, and then when we get finished reading the book, we read the book again. We turn this book over every year at Simchat Torah. All of them together, collectively, are part of the Jewish DNA. Whether you go to Simchat Torah service or not, whether you say Shacharit Mincha Maariv or not, whether you wear tzitzis and tefillin or not, it's part of the aura that makes us who we are, and it distinguishes us across borders or boundaries or national identities. The phrase that catches me is self-determination, it's choice, but I also reinforce it, even though it came along only in the 1870s, was the phrase that Michael started the whole presentation out with, and that was Hatikva. And that's the phrase, Lihiyot Am Chofshi B'Artzenu, to be a free people in our land. Now, that's a dream. It's not a reality yet. My question for Michael is, when did the rabbis concede, or did some of them ever concede, that Jews could intervene in their history and they could make a change and they could make a difference. What kind of intellectual struggle was there amongst rabbis? And when might that have taken place?
Ben-Gurion told the Peel Commission in 1937, and this is a quote, "I say on behalf of the Jews that the Bible is our mandate," capital M, by the way. "The Bible, which was written by us in our language, in Hebrew, in this very country. That is our mandate. It was only recognition of this right which was expressed in the Balfour Declaration." That's really what you were saying, Ken, that Ben-Gurion was not a religious person, but he certainly saw the Bible as the patrimony of the Jewish people. Just quickly, religious Zionism does evolve in the late 1800s as a response to saying, we're not going to do the whole messianic thing. Maybe there's a part of it that we can do. It's sort of like, you remember the old automobiles? You had to go outside and crank up the engine, and then it went. Okay, so we're going to crank it, and then God's going to take over. And there's this struggle with a totally quietistic messianism where we're on the sidelines and let God do everything, to saying, because things were getting so bad in Eastern Europe, because it was so miserable, and because of the violence and the poverty, the Jews said, we've got to do something. And there was almost a pragmatic dimension to it, which is, we're not violating the ultimate redemption, but we're going to get it started by cranking the engine on our own. And then, of course, Rabbi Kook in the 20th century develops a much more robust, literally almost supernatural messianic posture within Judaism, where statism, especially taken over by his son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, that the IDF and power and state are all messengers of God to bring about the Messiah. And that, of course, is the full-blown religious Zionism that most people identify with the settler movement. I just want to take Ari's question briefly. He asked, would I make the argument that secular Zionism also incorporated some of the religious or non-secular elements that I mentioned as well? This is a very difficult subject because I think a lot of concepts are always morphing in the history of religion. They're taken and they're given new life, and then they're taken again and given a different kind of take, a different spin. And this is just part of religious history. So even when you take secular Zionism, and actually Gershom Scholem wrote a lot about this, that he thought, the secular Zionists thought it was strictly secular, but they were taking really powerful ideas from the history of Judaism, and they didn't even know the potential explosiveness of some of their ideas. They didn't even realize it. So I don't think it's that they necessarily incorporated it, because it was part of Jewish civilization. Especially the majority of Zionists, as Ken mentioned, came from Eastern Europe, from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Religion was in the air. It wasn't like this is religious and this is secular. That distinction didn't exist. Jewishness, Yiddishkeit is the Yiddish word. So much of these ideas were already sort of in the Jewish cultural lexicon. One of the best examples on the purely cultural plane is the Ad Lo Yada parade. There's a Purim parade in Tel Aviv. Believe me, they're not running to hear the Megillah at night, but they want to have that parade. They want to have costumes. They want to get, a little happy and inebriated. But the idea of this is part of Jewish culture without sinking it into the roots of a religious perspective on a holiday. Hanukkah, if you go to Israel today, Hanukkah was transformed into a Maccabean victory of the military. It wasn't this little amount of oil lasting for 8 days. So that is a great example, Ari, of you take a cultural component and you transvalue it. Now, the Zionists said, but that's what the rabbis did. They took a military success and they turned it into a miracle of an oil thing, as if that's the most important thing that happened. We're restoring the original impetus for the holiday of Hanukkah, which was the military conquest. So there's yin and yang within Judaism of a peoplehood and a religion, which the Enlightenment splits, but in Jewishness, it's all blended. I like to teach my students that it's a matter of emphasis. What take do you want to give it, rather than is it firmly in one camp or another? So I hope that's helpful.